And good morning to all of you. Welcome to the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at UC Berkeley. This is our spring town hall meeting, and all of you are either OLLI members or campus colleagues. And we're really glad that you can join us for the next 90 minutes. As you know, the town halls are designed to talk about urgent issues that involve campus, the state, the country, the world. And we're really happy that we have an expanded panel who's coming from different parts of the country, which we're really happy to welcome them to this 90 minutes. As you know, Darren Zook is our moderator for today, and so he will begin the program with introductions. And again, thank you for being here. We will record this session and make it available after it's been captioned. Thank you. Darren, all yours.
Good morning, everyone. I know some of you actually saw me already on Wednesday morning, so sorry if seeing me twice in the same week is adding a little more stress to your time, but I'm just the moderator today, so I'll keep things moving along. I know all of you are Zoom experts at this point, but just to remind everyone, as our panelists are speaking, they're going to give you some insightful comments to start things off. And then the second part of the program will be questions from you. Feel free, as the speakers are speaking, to write your questions and comments in the chat section. I'll be monitoring them. And then after the last speaker goes, I'll basically field the questions and direct them to the speakers, and that's the way things are going to go. The topic, of course, is let's get engaged. It's 2024. It's an election year in the United States, and there's so much happening in the world, and we're going to hear everything from local engagement to global engagement today from all the speakers. And so, rather than take up any more time, I'm going to go right ahead and introduce our first speaker for today. First speaker for today is going to be Tom Oliphant. He is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist and Washington columnist for the Boston Globe, a regular commentator on PBS NewsHour. He's also the author of 4 books, including The Road to Camelot. Tom, I will yield the digital floor to you.
Thanks so very much, and what a pleasure it is to be here, especially digitally, as one who is not quite comfortable with the 21st century. I love the opportunity to learn more. I wanted to begin by assuring everybody that if you're obsessed with a certain trial in New York City, I share your obsession. I follow every minute of it. I have a very good friend who's inside the courtroom who sends me private letters 3 times a day. And my obsession will not diminish as the trial proceeds. I am also obsessed with the presidential election, which is obviously pivotal and critical in modern American history, maybe all of American history. I follow it, of course, carefully, in minute detail sometimes. But I wanted to make another point here, and that is to urge you all not only to not forget about the Congress, but to get involved in the elections for Congress. One of my mentors in politics, the late House Speaker Thomas P. Tip O'Neill Jr., famously said that all politics ultimately is local. It's not true this year. The contests for Congress, especially the House of Representatives, may occasionally involve a local bridge or a post office, but they're really about the direction of the country, just as much as the presidential election is. And the opportunities for involvement are much more open in the races for Congress. And if you're thinking of getting involved or you're already involved, I hope it is at the local level. To illustrate, it turns out, luckily, a couple of things have happened back here in the last 12 hours, and indeed in the last 2 hours, that illustrate the point I'm trying to make. Late last night, an institution called the House Rules Committee was considering this package of aid programs for Ukraine, Israel, countries in the Far East, and a couple of other matters. And in the mess that is the current Congress, the current House, there simply were not the votes in the Republican majority of this committee to clear anything for action on the floor, meaning that there was no way to get aid to the countries involved without a vote in this Rules Committee. There were 3 very far right Republicans who refused to support anything. What happened around midnight, actually, was that all the Democrats voted to send these measures to the floor, and combined with the Republicans on the committee who were willing to do it, a handful, what happened was a bipartisan vote in the House Rules Committee made a vote possible. I have never seen that in my career, where the members of one party provided the majority for the other party initiative. And it continued this morning. There was a vote. Tomorrow, the actual votes on the aid programs will occur. There'll be, I think, 4 or 5 roll call votes. But the key one was this morning on the mechanism for the floor action called a rule. And what happened was 316 members from both parties in the House voted to go forward. An astonishing bipartisan vote. There were more Democrats in favor of this procedural vote, 165, than Republicans, 151. But again, the point remains, nothing would have happened if, as is normally the case, one depended on the majority party in the House, the Republicans, to pass this rule. They were 60 plus votes short. But the Democrats provided the margin, as has been the case earlier this year on a couple of budget-related votes. And in this amazing development, as I say, it just happened a couple of hours ago, you can see the outlines of questions that will be resolved by voters and people who choose to get involved this November. By common consensus, there are a few dozen, maybe 35. My list contains 33 House races that in the end will determine which party controls the House at the end of next year. Interestingly, as I said at the beginning, I understand the obsession with the presidential race. I share it. But it's also true that the members, for example, of the House of Representatives that are elected this November, the first thing they will do in January, basically, is they will be asked to certify the results of the Electoral College votes in the states for president. So the identity of these people in January starts off by being pivotal. In addition, whatever prospects there are, depending on what your issue points of view are, for action in a host of areas, whether it's taxes, whether to bring back the child tax credit, what to do about reproductive rights, all of whatever agenda Biden might come up with if he were reelected, or Trump might come up with if he is elected, will be determined by the House that is elected this November. And as I said, my list is 33 House races for what it's worth. And what's interesting about the list is that fully a third of the competitive races in the country are going to occur in what we call blue states, Democratic states, including 5 right where you all are in California. They're not big city congressional districts. They tend to be suburban and ex-urban. Those of you who choose to get involved, and you really ought to consider diving into a House race, will discover that the swing voters are not liberal. They are independent, and they sometimes, even often, have a history of voting for Republican candidates. And the 5 in California are classically illustrative. You have the 27th, that's northern San Fernando Valley for detail freaks. You have the 13th, Merced is the center of it. The 22nd, that's the part of Bakersfield that Kevin McCarthy didn't represent, heading into the San Joaquin Valley. There's the 45th, which classic suburban Orange County, a little bit of LA County, think Garden Grove. And then there's the 40th. Again, almost classically suburban, centered around places like Tustin and Mission Viejo, just to mention 2 communities. In these areas, Robert Kennedy Jr., or the third, or whatever his name is, will not be much of a factor. He may be of interest in West LA or perhaps Venice or places like that. But the congressional districts I've cited are truly what we call swing districts. Right there, you could change the majority rule in the House of Representatives, or you could keep what you have now, just on the basis of what happens in California. But California is not the only blue state that has this phenomena. Another 6 congressional districts that will be very competitive are located in New York and one across the Hudson in New Jersey, primarily the result of a redistricting mess a couple of years ago, but still very competitive. And so right there, there are 11 congressional districts in the country in blue states that are likely to determine who controls the House of Representatives next year. And your involvement, if you choose to do it, will not be just a matter of mobilizing natural supporters if you're Democrats among a liberal base. Victory will come from persuading people that we tend to call independents. Actually, they lean, the undecided voters in these districts tend to lean toward Republicans under normal circumstances. But this is a situation where the result is going to be terribly important to what happens not only in January, but for 4 years thereafter. Just as important in the end as whether or not President Biden is reelected. And therefore, anybody who chooses to be involved in a congressional race, one of these 33, is probably more critically involved than somebody who knocks on doors canvassing in the presidential race. Let me say one word before I shut up about the Senate. The conventional wisdom is missing a very important late development. It's true that the Democrats, having lost already West Virginia for all intents and purposes, are doing much better than anybody expected in two very tough situations, one in Montana and the other in Ohio. If they were to hold those, the Senate would be still under Democratic control, but there's a new wrinkle, and it's in the state of Maryland. A fairly popular Republican governor named Larry Hogan will have a very big advantage going into this election to replace a Democrat. The Democrat has not been chosen. The primaries just will occur shortly. But Larry Hogan will start off with a real advantage. And it's quite possible that the control of the United States Senate will depend on what happens there. And so if any of you can afford the airfare, you might want to consider coming to Maryland and getting involved in the Senate race, which will be pivotal and critical. Let me close just by telling you where I am, which may ring a bell with you all in terms of the circumstances. I'm sitting in rural Virginia on the edge of the Blue Ridge Mountains, where I live half the time. There's a Senate race here. It's not yet clearly competitive. Sound familiar? Tim Kaine is in a fairly strong position. The state is not really competitive yet for president. It's possible that Trump could do some business here, but it hasn't happened yet. On the other hand, there are at least 2 and maybe 3 congressional districts in this state that are going to be competitive. And again, to wind up what I have to say, what happens in the House is going to happen in just a small number of places, and California happens to be one of them.
All right. Thank you so much, Tom. That was such a wonderful overview of not only what's at stake in 2024, but also of the key races. That's quite the overview in just 15 minutes. So thanks for that. We are going to move on to our next speaker, who I'll now introduce. Our next speaker is Bob Brandon, who is the president and CEO of the Fair Elections Center, which is a national nonpartisan voting rights and election reform organization whose mission is to use litigation and advocacy to remove barriers to registration and voting. Bob, I will now yield the digital floor over to you.
Thank you, Darren, and hello, everyone. Good morning. I want to just talk a little bit about the broad landscape that we're operating in for this year's election, and just thinking about it as we are approaching the 250th year of our democracy, and remembering that the first 2 centuries were really about expanding voting rights. First it was male landowners only, and then it was all white men, and then it was moving on to giving women the right to vote and African Americans the right to vote, 18-year-olds the right to vote, Native Americans the right to vote. But it seems like in the last 10 or 15 years, we're moving in the opposite direction. And there's been a real effort to restrict voting rights. It's sort of amazing to me as a voting rights advocate that there's explicit efforts to try to turn back the clock, to look at who has power and who doesn't, and to make sure that certain constituencies are limited, particularly after some of the 2010 elections redistricting, gerrymandering, which brought a big change to state legislatures around the country, and began to see, I started this organization in 2006. It was the year of the first photo ID had been passed in Indiana. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court at the time, without looking at any evidence of its impact, decided it wasn't a problem. But that was literally the first time that you began to see changes. In 2013, the Supreme Court ruled in the Shelby case, as many of you probably know, to restrict the most important part of voting rights protections in the country, which is the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and essentially got rid of the protections that wouldn't have allowed any local government or state government to make changes in voting rights without a review first by the Justice Department or the courts to make sure it didn't have a discriminatory impact. With that pre-clearance out of the way, literally within days, the first state, North Carolina, passed a comprehensive set of bills that would bring in photo ID and restrict early voting and restrict a number of other voting. And since then, we've just seen state after state passing laws to make it harder to vote, whether it was harder to register, harder to stay on the rolls, harder to or have limited options for early voting or absentee ballots, et cetera, et cetera. Our organization works in a sort of in 4 different fronts. We advocate both at the legislative level in about 15 states. Administratively, we work around the country to work with election officials to get more polling places, for example, on college campuses or in communities that have traditionally not had enough access to voting in neighborhoods. We, for the last 2 years, have worked on helping to implement the current administration's executive order to try to get more executive branch agencies to promote voter registration. We just helped the education department, relevant to many of you, to put out a toolkit on what colleges and universities can do to help facilitate voter registration, voter education, and turnout programs on their campuses, which gets to my third point. I'm sorry, let me go second. We litigate. We have challenged a number of these laws and successfully knocked them down. We've successfully challenged improper purging of voters in Wisconsin. We've successfully challenged limits on felon reenfranchisement for felons after they finish their sentences. We have knocked down some restrictions on third-party registration groups in places like Florida. For many communities, groups that are able to go in and help people register is essential. And then we do a lot of education. We have guides for all 50 states on simple voting information for organizers, for regular people. And one of the keys that we've done is we launched in 2012 in partnership with college administrators, the Campus Vote Project, and we work in partnership with about 360 college campuses around the country with 4.6 million enrolled students to make sure that the schools bake into the academic mission of the institution voter education, voter registration, and opportunities to get students to actually vote in either on their campus or in the campus community. And we have a voter-friendly campus program that institutionalizes that work. And then lastly, very importantly, we support election officials. As you've seen the attack in recent years against people that are simply trying to do their job to make sure that our democracy works by allowing people to vote. So it's both 27 states have now passed restrictions on anybody outside being able to provide anything of value to help support election officials. During the pandemic, many outside companies provided PPE. They provided cash support. Foundations provided cash support because most elections are not funded adequately at all. So we've been promoting and lobbying for greater resources for elections. We've started the largest poll worker recruitment program in the country called Power the Polls. which we're really encouraging more people, particularly younger people, and a more diverse community to sign up to be poll workers, so that the people that are helping folks vote look more like the folks that they're helping. So what does it all look like for us in 2024? First of all, there continues to be new barriers to voting, as I mentioned, whether it's restricting ways folks can get registered to vote, whether it's restricting the time that there's early voting, whether it's restricting the time that absentee ballots can be counted, so that if they're cast before the election but come in after the election, they can still be counted. More limits, more voter ID laws in place, and continued limits on what election officials can do, and particularly opening up poll worker challengers to be in the polls and to be able to do more intimidating things, frankly, than they normally are allowed to do because of some of the laws that have changed recently. So those are the bad things. The good things are there are a lot of new reforms that are taking place in opening up more early voting, online registration, same-day registration, automatic reenfranchisement of felons. So this is happening in places like New Mexico and Minnesota and Michigan and New York. And that's the good thing. So we see barriers, we also see new laws. And the key to all of this is to make sure that people know what the rules are. And this is where you all come in, because you can do this in California. So even in a place like California that has pretty good laws, there are changes and there are new processes, and people sometimes don't vote because they get confused about what the new processes are. So it's important to provide that education. For those of you that are inclined, like Tom said, to help out at other places, you can do it remotely as well, or you can do with, encouraging people to work, or maybe your colleagues that happen to be at another institution of higher education, encourage them to do more with their school. Making sure that folks have the information they need. We like to say in the work that we do that the most important election protection there is adequate voter education. There are plenty of barriers being thrown at constituencies, particularly people that have traditionally had barriers thrown at them, and the African-American community, and now some of the immigrant communities, certainly young people. But it motivates them to want to get involved and vote, and we need to help give them the means to do that. I know our program with young people, the number one reason that young people say they don't vote is they don't know what to do. They're confused, they're a little bit concerned, they get misinformation. Some of them hear that if they register in their college community, their parents can't claim them on their taxes, or they'll lose their health coverage from their health insurance plan, none of which is true, but they need to know that. So it's really important to provide good information to folks. And, and all of this starts with voter registration. If you're not on the voter rolls, you can't vote. Now, there are states that have same-day registration. We really encourage, we've pushed hard to make sure that there is either same-day registration or election day registration. It's ultimately the great fail-safe, because if something does happen with your registration, you can always get it fixed on election day. So that's a really important thing to do. And if you talk to people, it's not just, are you registered, but also make sure you check your registration, because things can change, or you might move. There are some states where if you move even in the same community, you have to update your registration. So just suggest that you really do that. And think about all the different ways you can talk to friends, neighbors, as I said, former colleagues, if you're not active anymore in the university community, who might be around the country, to make sure that they weigh in with their institutions. I can't tell you how important it is to get college administrators and faculty to talk to their students. They show up, the institutions and professors show up as very trusted sources of information for students. So it's really important. It's kind of what we rely on. The work we do on college campuses goes through the school. It's not us talking to students, it's the school talking to students and the professors. And that's really important. And then the other thing is to support election officials. And you can do that by advocating in your own county more resources for elections. You can also do it by volunteering to be poll workers. So I think that's also really important. And then in that regard, there's a lot of talk about people are going to be told to go to the polls and make sure there's no cheating. It's what Donald Trump did in 2020. He said, go to Detroit, go to Philadelphia, make sure there's no cheating. And everybody can be very intimidated. I always like to say there's strength in numbers. We turned out 700,000 people through our poll worker recruitment program in 2020 in the height of the pandemic. And those are folks that make a difference. They're helping their neighbors. For young people who get involved in working at the polls, they become lifelong advocates for working at the polls or supporting their neighborhood and their voting. So that's really important. And then lastly, I know Tom focused on the congressional dynamic, and I agree completely with him. But don't forget to tell everybody to look down the ballot and vote down ballot. Almost all of the problems that we face on the election side, and then think about access to women's health and think about gun violence and so on and so forth, happens at the state legislative level. All the gerrymandering that has taken place is what's created this dynamic and created the rush for voter suppression and the reactionary laws that we see. And the final thing I say as a voter organization that also is nonpartisan, young people in particular are not partisan, but they sure do care about issues. And our job is to make sure that they understand that the political process is still something that can make a difference, basically because it can show them the power they have as young people to be involved. The most motivating thing that I've seen people who do some of the research for us is when college students that we did focus groups with in 2022 were told that their record turnout in 2020 led to the youngest, most diverse Congress in history being elected. That's very motivating because now it's not their one vote. It's their vote as a group that has made a difference. And they look at people now running for office that are like them and their age and their diversity, and it really can make a difference. I'm going to stop there. I'd love to answer questions when we get down to that.
All right. Thank you so much, Bob. After hearing Tom's overview of the congressional contest, we have to remind ourselves, as you did, that there's also the other side of it, which is the challenge of just getting people to vote and the challenges placed in the way of voting. So off to a good overview of everything. We're going to shift gears a little bit here, and we're going to hear from Shannon Thomas next. Not only is Shannon a UC Berkeley alumnus, but she is definitely a Hall of Fame student, and I say that to embarrass her. We don't have a Hall of Fame, but if we did, she should definitely be in it. She's the founder and principal at Just Media LLC, a community conflict resolution, crisis communications, and transformative justice agency. She served as the speechwriter for Congresswoman Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez during her first congressional run in 2018. Shannon, I will now yield the digital floor to you.
Thank you, Professor Zook. I am adequately embarrassed and really honored to be here with you all. It may sound a little strange why I am here right now, especially given that I came from the peace and conflict studies world. Very much had the intention of doing international peace building and was finishing my master's in public policy and conflict resolution at Harvard when Trump was elected in 2016. Was very, it shook everybody, as I'm sure y'all have felt in your own lives. But I remember the day after the election, none of the balloons had dropped from the night before. There was supposed to be an election party in the forum. And that day, all of the professors were coming to their classes saying, how did we get it so wrong? Where did we miss the mark? That was the general sentiment of everyone on campus. And it really brought to question, I think, for myself, but for a lot of us, how stable is our democracy? How are our metrics of analysis for what makes a functioning democracy? And are we looking at the right sources of information to get accurate, adequate understanding of what's going on? And I think our answer right now is no. For many young people, for many, many young people who don't know what sources to trust, what sources of information to look to. Professor Zook was talking about misinformation earlier, and just like digital literacy, being able to read for yourself and critically think about, okay, is this an accurate news article, or is this a deep fake? Is this something that has not been vetted, or is this something that I can stake my trust in and share? We, as a generation, have lost fundamental faith in institutions. I think that is the biggest risk to the Democratic Party right now. So I'm not going to speak from my own personal opinions about the Democratic Party, but what I've been observing in grassroots organizing since 2016. And what has reared its head time and time again, both at the national level, doing congressional campaigns with Alexandra Ocasio and Cori Bush, to state and local races like Measure R and decarceration. People are turning out for issues, and they're being time and time again disappointed with the results that we're seeing, not because of the lack of quality of people who are running for office. More people than ever are seeing ourselves reflected in office. And then we're seeing ourselves have our values compromised and have to make, 10 hours of fundraising calls a day and be, vulnerable to lobbying and public pressure and the intensity of money in politics. We've felt very sold out, frankly. And we've talked a little bit about voter motivation. What I am most scared of right now is that the people who you want to be working at the polls, the people who you want to be knocking doors and making phone banking calls and recruiting others to get excited and engaged, they're not even sure if our democracy is functional. A lot of those folks are, voting in the primaries undecided nationally. They're leaving blanks on the presidential contest, and maybe they're voting in state and local, or maybe they're not voting at all. The state assembly race that I was working on in South Central during this most recent primary election had 11% turnout. And this is with California being a state that has automatic voter registration and automatic mail-in ballots. Everyone received a ballot in the mail weeks before the election, and we still had 11% turnout. And the Black and brown communities, but also young people, are just not here for it. They're not sure what benefit is going to come from them actually voting. And I think what we need to get real engagement is like some authentic leadership at local levels to prove to people that this is not fruitless, even if the outcome is not what you want. This is not fruitless. This is important. This is our civic duty, and not in the sense of like we're obligated to the state, but this is how we protect one another. This is how we look out for our neighbors, and they need to believe that. So a couple of things that I've noticed opportunity-wise in democratic organizing are that people are being turned out by real information packaged in a way that they can understand. And I'm thinking about the Kenneth Mejia race for city controller in Los Angeles as a key example. I never knew what a controller was. I didn't know that was relevant. And suddenly there are billboards all over the city that show the audits of the different departments and the different LA city budgets. And the police budget is here, and education, housing, homelessness, healthcare is over here. That race had more votes for city controller than they did for LA mayor. And Karen Bass was running. Everyone knows Karen Bass. People want to be informed. They want to understand what's going on because we don't understand what's going on. Why are people who are contractors making so much money? And all of the city, state, local, national, all of the campaigns, there's this extreme, like, yeah, it's a political industrial complex. And that money is not actually being translated into impacting the lives of the young people who are, doing the volunteer work on those campaigns, or the lives of the people who are most vulnerable in our communities. So other than being like an authentic straight shooter, which, people say that that's why they like Donald Trump too. Clearly that's not the only solution, but you have to demonstrate that there's going to be some value add that you can contribute to these people's lives. Another instance from the Kenneth Mejia campaign that I saw that was really effective is they had CPAs doing tax preparation for people. So many individuals decided to get registered to vote or realized that they could vote because they had to pay their taxes. Thinking about the threats that we're facing to organizing, I think the possibility of people deciding that it is just not worth our time or energy to be active participants in the Democratic Party, I think that's a genuine risk. And I'm taking that from 3 pieces of information. One is the war tax resistor movement. Since the Vietnam War, there has never been such an enormous effort to not pay your taxes. And that is because people are unwilling to put their tax money to unaudited Pentagon spending that is basically a blank check for war since the 2001 authorization for the use of military force. And we're seeing the ramifications of that in Gaza right now. The other piece of information is how many people are registering for third parties. It is something that's really hard for me to negotiate with my peers, because anybody who looks or exists in a body like mine has some well-founded existential fear of Donald Trump. And there's a lot of trauma, and that also is causing a lot of people to just stop paying attention and stop focusing on the national political level. And because of that, people are registering third party, the Party for Socialism and Liberation, with Claudia de la Cruz. Cornel West just announced Melina Abdullah, the leader of Black Lives Matter Los Angeles, as his vice presidential running mate. And now there's a major effort to have people re-register for the, what are they calling it? Freedom and Liberation Party? And frankly, hearing especially from Tom about the state races, I am worried that if we lambast these people too much for re-registering, they're also not going to vote on any of the down ballot elections. If you try to sell somebody who is firmly, I'm not going to vote for Joe Biden in this election, I'm not going to vote for Trump either, but I'm not voting for them. If we go too hard on those folks who have valid frustrations with our political system, they're not going to vote in the state Senate, the House races, the local races. Maybe they just won't vote at all. And we risk losing. I mean, maybe not the base, not the base of the Democratic Party, but the base of the organizers for the Democratic Party. And there was a New York Times article that came out recently about Biden fearing losing his youth climate organizers, that the climate organizers were part of his fuel for the campaign. And it's, you know, primarily young, white, college-educated folks who are also now saying, unless there's a ceasefire before November, we won't vote for Joe Biden. That is big danger mode. I mean, in some ways, it's an opportunity if we were able to miraculously have peace in the Middle East right now. But I think the more likely scenario is that we get manipulated into an even worse foreign policy position. This will be my last, you know, thing to say, but oh wait, there's one more thing. Okay, two things. Iran hostage crisis. During the Carter and Reagan era, Carter, known as a peacenik, was not able to have the crisis resolved before the election. Reagan won. Reagan had been coordinating with the Iranian regime to not have the hostages released until after the election for this specific reason. If we don't think that that same sort of manipulation is happening behind the scenes, and that the same sort of like interpersonal weird dynamics between world leaders that's not happening, I think that's just a little naive on our part. And then switching from very global to hyper local, and this will be the last thing I say because I think it's the most important one. People are desperate. People are struggling. Folks can't pay rent. They can't afford their prescription medications. They can't afford, you know, milk at the grocery store. They can't afford gas. If you want to engage people, provide for their basic needs. Literally, the food, you know, basket giveaways that we have done on different campaigns across the city had the most voter turnout of any of the organizing spaces that I've seen this past year. It's because people want fruit and vegetables to bring home to their family, not because they necessarily love the candidate, but at least they got into the room and they learned about the candidate. And now they are like, well, at least there's one candidate who cares that my kids are fed. So feed the kids, moral of the story.
All right. Thank you so much, Shannon. That was such a great cup of coffee in the form of words, things like that, to give us a good wake-up call for all the things that are at stake in this election as well. On your last comment about feed the kids, I'm waiting to see which candidate brings back in reference to Reagan, which candidate brings back the Reagan phrase, "Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago?" I'm really waiting for who's going to say that first. We'll see how that goes. But really, thank you so much for that. We have one speaker left, and I know some questions are rolling in. And if you have questions or comments, please put them in the chat, and I'll get to them as soon as our last speaker speaks. That's going to be Susan Driscoll, who I know is familiar to many, if not all of you. She's a longtime OLLI member and has spearheaded and participated in a large number of Get Out the Vote initiatives, and I think that's what she's going to talk about now. So, Susan, I yield the digital floor to you.
Thank you, Darren, and thanks, Tom, Bob, and Shannon. It's interesting to hear from you from around the country. I'm here, and I just want to let you all know that we will be having another meeting virtual. I'm not sure whether it will be in person as well, giving you lots and lots of ways that you get to dive in, but I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview today. Excuse me, I want to start with a documentary that was shown on January 2nd, 2024, featuring Richard Haas, President Emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations and author of a book called The Bill of Obligations, 10 Habits of Good Citizens. He was on with Ari Srinivasan, and they presented a wonderful list of obligations on becoming a good citizen called A Citizen's Guide to Preserving Democracy. And I bring this up because all of the people we've heard have given you ways, in some ways, to be involved on one level or another. I'm going to be more specific when we have this next meeting. But right now, here are the 11 obligations. Modeling civility. Be informed, and that's identifying fact from fiction. Be media wise. There is a group called Media Wise. And know that the young people are getting their news off of social media, and that can be skewed all the time. Number 3, value norms. Mr. Trump, as we know, broke down all the norms. Be aware of them, respect them, and hold those norms, value them. Get involved, community engagement. I mean, and I'm talking about from the election, but also in other ways. Know your community, know the people you are living and sharing the same space with. Be a voter. There is nothing more important to keeping our democracy than being a voter. And that means talking to everybody else. As Mr. Haas says, the stakes are enormous. And by the way, he says, if you're not worried, you're not paying attention. And that's so key. Number 6 is stay open to compromise. You might actually learn something. Support the teaching of civics. You know, it went out in the 60s. And right now, the little bits, and this is in high schools, by the way, the scores are now the lowest they've been in 30 years. We have to do something. We have to get civics back into the curriculums in our schools. Number 8, promote the common good. There are examples of this when you see this documentary, and I know you can find it on PBS Passport, by the way. I encourage you to do that. It is a wonderful, wonderful documentary. Reject violence. Number 9, we are bracing ourselves for possible violence, no matter how this election turns out. Reject it, okay? Respect government service. And there are all kinds of programs going on in Iowa and in California called Lead for America, in Iowa, American Connection Corps. Support your government, people in government service. And the last thing is to put country first. Actually, Reagan said it, patriotism is not enough. Informed patriotism is what politics is all about. I know young people, and we heard it from Shannon, we hear it from these young people, they don't want to deal with politics anymore. They really hate it. And they hate the institutions, and everything affects them and how they're going to approach this election. If they understand that many of their freedoms will be taken away, this is something. And so if you have something that you want to hone in to get involved, that's great. But the most important areas as all of these people have brought up, are the local elections, starting with your own city, moving out to districts, county, state, and particularly now state legislatures. So, and there are ways, we're going to show you ways to do this. I know that you can join groups to do things, or you can do it solo. What we're fighting this year, I think, is the couch. A lot of people don't want to get off the couch and go vote. And so we really have to support efforts. And Susan teases me about this, about supporting groups that have boots on the ground. As Shannon said, to have people going door to door, talking to people who look just like them, to explain what's going on, explain their role in this whole, democracy move. That's what that's all about. And again, sometimes you can just donate. We'll give you all kinds of lists of places who vet organizations. And if all you want to do is throw money at stuff, this will define it all for you, tell you where that money goes best, from food banks, perhaps, as Shannon was talking about, to young people going door to door, to BIPOC organizations, all kinds of things where you can actually make a difference in that way. Some of the local groups here, by the way, just so you know, are TWW Albany, which is Together We Win, and they're very, very active. All the groups everybody's very active right now in the Central Valley of California, because as we know, those fights are crucial to the House and the Senate, but particularly the House. Another one is All Rise Alameda, again, focusing on the Central Valley. And both of these groups have a lot of canvassing, writing postcards or letters, donating, and so forth. And then I have our little letter writing group, which you're all welcome to join, rejoin, which we started in 2020, and it's still going. Also, one of the things you can do is watch for things that are coming up, various Zooms by various organizations. And again, some of them are, Common Ground, and so forth. That one thing that's coming up this weekend, actually next Thursday, I'm sorry, is a Zoom. Jane Fonda and Dolores Huerta are having Zoom to talk about what's going on down there, and something called Why the Central Valley Matters. And tomorrow, actually, the Commonwealth Club is doing, has the Reframe Festival, and that's with Judy Woodruff. And I'm sure anybody who watches PBS News is aware of Judy Woodruff, because how could you not? She's going around the country and seeing why we're so divided. Anyway, I don't want to run too long here, but I just want to say that we will be presenting a whole list of all kinds of organizations where you can allow the people to help you find where to spend your bucks, if that's all you want to do, or if you want to get more deeply engaged, writing postcards, writing letters, making calls, texting, all those kinds of things. The California Democratic Party is incredibly strong, and many of these things are all done through something called mobilize.us. You can find out how to do that. The Republican Party has their areas, the Cal GOP, WW-Cal GOP. So this is not just all one-sided. It's really about just getting involved, making a difference. And if you really want some interesting perspectives on all of this, a lot of former Republicans are writing for Substack and Bulwark, where you can get a perspective on everything that's happening. Some of those people, and I think most of you will know who Heather Cox Richardson is. We approached her for this particular meeting. Unfortunately, she's a very busy woman, and you can understand why. She wrote Democracy Awakening, and a marvelous book to show how we stand from an historical perspective. It's a wonderful book, and she's speaking out everywhere to, again, understand the danger we're in of losing our democracy. As well, you can find Robert Hubble, Simon Rosenberg, Jessica Craven, Bill Crystal, Joe Perticone, and others. They all write things you get a little more hopeful when you read what they have to say. Anyway, we have lots more. I'm not going to go on any further. Just be aware that we will be letting you know about an upcoming meeting that will detail some of these other groups that you can get involved in. So and I'm going to be missing some of them. So if you have some that you might want to let us know about, that'd be great. We can add it to the list. Some of them will be from 2020 and sort of retooled for this particular election. This is a crucial one, folks. Get involved.
Well said, Susan. Thank you so much for that. I will say, Susan, while I'm transitioning into the question and answer part of today, I had a couple of folks wrote in and asked if you could maybe type in the names of a few of the organizations you mentioned into the chat.
I would, but there are so many, and to even begin that, that's why I'm going to invite them to come and see the whole list. I want to hear the rest of this too.
Okay, fair enough. We'll find a way to get that list to everybody who's here today. We'll figure it out. And thanks for reminding us to fight the couch. Always a good slogan to live by. I'm going to start our questions, and this one's actually directed to Tom. It comes from Brian, and I'm going to throw a little twist into it based upon something Shannon said. So the question is, will there be presidential debates? I know, Tom, you talked about mostly congressional and Senate races, but let's bring it back to the presidential race here. Will there be presidential debates? Should there be? That question, I think, is interesting. Should we actually have them? And then Shannon mentioned, that younger voters are in many ways turning to what we always call third-party candidates like Cornel West, because they're just disenchanted with what the mainstream gives us, and whether or not we should, this election cycle, perhaps either put those voices into presidential debates or give them more media time than we usually do. We usually take third-party candidates and just shove them to the side. So that's directed at Tom. I'll give the other panelists a chance to respond if they want to, but Tom, would you like to comment on that?
Last part first. The poor third-party people are shunted aside, and agitation should commence and never stop until more attention is paid to what they have to say to give them a chance in the public square. The televised debates are a different proposition, I believe. I've been forced to cover every one since 1980, when they resumed. And sometimes they're a metaphor for the election. Sometimes they nudge the contest one way or another. Sometimes they help people feel more strongly about how they already feel, but they help. And for a huge chunk, the research is just clear on this. For a huge chunk of the country, 90, 100 million people, they see the debates as theirs. I realize there's a so-called bipartisan coalition that puts these things on, but it really is nonpartisan. And it's to be hoped that there are a few occasions this fall when the two finalists have this chance, regardless of how the rules were abused the last time by Mr. Trump's behavior. Now, the question, however, it always comes up, what about third-party candidates in the debates? And my bias has always been with a Harvard professor, expert on the presidency, sadly now gone, Richard Neustadt, who was the consultant for the debate commission dealing with the thorny problem, not of Ross Perot the first time, but Ross Perot the second time, when he did not get an invitation to participate. And Professor Neustadt called around political hacks like me, trying to get a sense of how things were going in advance of the debate. And he asked one question. He said, what is the chance that Mr. Perot can win a single electoral vote? And I thought about it for a while, and I said, well, in answer to your question, the answer is 0. And on that basis, the commission did not invite Ross Perot the second time. I think it's a fair criterion that the debates are presenting for the public one of two people who have a chance to become the next president. And I think that's good enough.
All right. Thank you, Tom. I'll ask the other panelists if they want to add anything to this. So Bob or Shannon or Susan, would you like to add to that? Or otherwise I can move on to our next question. I guess that means no. Okay.
I could add just a quick thing.
Yeah, go right ahead.
Clarifying question. Does that mean RFK and Marianne Williamson are not on the debate stage either? 2, do you think that having third-party candidates would increase the viewership of... Why do I have balloons?
I don't know, but it looked very festive.
All right. Well, party. Okay. Do you think the viewership would increase if the third-party candidates were present? And there was one more question I had, but now I can't remember. So I'll leave it at that.
Very quickly, not appreciably. It's the circumstances on the night of the debate that have the biggest impact on the size of the audience, in my experience.
All right. And there it is. I'm going to move on to another question. This comes in from Jackie, and it's directed actually to Shannon. And it says, can you say more about how voting is the way we take care of each other, and also how to explain this to the many disappointed young people who have lost faith in democracy? So if you'd like to speak more to that or expand on that, it's all yours.
Yeah, so I mean, at the very basic level, I think, you know, when I'm considering what my vote does, I'm not just considering its impact on myself, but its impact on my unhoused neighbors, my non-voting neighbors, my non-citizen neighbors. And my vote is considering their well-being as much as it is my own. On a literal level, when you build effective networks of community organizers at a local level with some goal in, shared and in mind, those people also do take care of one another, and having mutual aid connections and just like knowing your neighbors, meeting your neighbors, I think that also is how we take care of each other in the long term. And lastly, thinking about all of the sacrifice that our elders put in to get the vote, I kind of return to my sense of obligation, if not to my own self, to the people who, were beaten at the polls trying to register voters or trying to get registered themselves. I'm thinking of Miss Fannie Lou Hamer and Ella Baker and all of the people who didn't have our opportunities. I would bring up some of those points to folks who are tempted to not vote.
All right. Thank you for that, Shannon. I'm going to kind of continue on this and wrap it back into the previous question, because whether it's presidential debates or whether it's, voting and all these things, what are we looking for? We're looking for well-informed voters. That's the ideal. There's always the saying, what does the politician fear the most? A well-informed electorate. And that brings us back to the issue of information. Not just information, but also misinformation and disinformation. For instance, there's been a tendency towards younger voters or to consume news from news feeds off of social media, for instance. Might be an alarming trend. And also, for Tom and Bob and Susan, I mean, if we're going to be well-informed voters and get off the couch, how can we enhance the caliber, not just of the information itself, but voters' abilities to consume that information? So I'll start this time around. I'll go back to, let's see, I'll start with Susan, since she was talking about things, and I'll just kind of work our way back through the panelists that way. So Susan, you have anything to say on that?
I do. It's hard to get informed. I think a lot of us, shall I say, seniors, if you will, tend to look at the broadcast news. We have to really understand that most of the young people are getting their news off of TikTok primarily, but other sources as well, Reddit or X or whatever. I'm sorry, I'm not on X, or Instagram. One thing that has occurred in the last few years, started in the college group and has now dropped down to the high school level, is a game called Verify It. You can all take it. It's all one word, verifyit.buzz. And if you go on, you can take a test to see how much you know about everything from the Constitution to perhaps news items, and see how you approach it. Those kinds of things are happening to discern the real thing from misinformation. And just, if it's like anything else, just check things out. If you don't want to play the game, it's fun. By the way, you get points. And young people love it for that reason. They love getting points. But try it on your own. Verifyit.buzz, capital I when you say verify it. And other ways, just read people whose stuff they trust, whether it's somebody, Paul Krugman in the New York Times or something else. Try and get as authentic, real stuff rather than just take the headline and go with that.
Okay, excellent advice. I'll work my way back through the other candidates just to see if they have anything to add. Shannon, would you like to add anything to this? Any words of advice or insights?
Yeah, trust is a big issue. And if young people are consuming off of social media, how do you get your information and your candidates into the portfolios of trusted organizations? I think one of the best ways to do that is really lobbying hard on the voter guides where you are aligned values-wise, because maybe they're not going to look into the state assembly and the judge and the mayor of their local town, but they will look at the, I don't know, the New Israel Fund or in the Green New Deal PAC or whatever organization is working at your local level that people trust and that accrue information. Get your candidates in there.
All right, thank you, Shannon. I will turn next to Bob to see if he has anything to add to this. Any thoughts on this, Bob?
I think there's two different things, and we look a lot at trying to get people basic information about voting, as I mentioned before. But most, and I may look like an old person. You probably noticed that, but we have 350 paid students that work in our program every semester. We work with our whole staff are much younger. And the communications that we do tries to connect people to information about candidates at all levels. It's all nonpartisan candidate guides, though, because as I mentioned before, it really is the right way to approach, particularly talk to younger voters who are not bought into either party, and nor should they be, I think, given what kind of Shannon was talking about. But the most important thing is in terms of how the information gets delivered. We did a lot of peer-to-peer voter education, for example, during the Georgia runoff in 2020 and 2022. It was all student-created content aimed at students. So it was hearing from your fellow student. It was a mail ballot election that nobody was used to ever doing, particularly young people. They wouldn't know where to find a stamp because they don't use the mail. And yet, we had like students at Norfolk State do a video of them rollerblading to the mailbox with their mail-in ballot and say, hey, this year we have to vote by mail. It gets huge pickup by the people that see it. And so we have just a lot, millions of impressions that are peer-to-peer, which is the most important way to reach people. And that's true, Shannon was saying, with other organizations. You have to get credible voices and not say that somebody that they don't really know. Another example is influencers. We use influencers all the time, but with the exception that we do have some nationally known people, but mostly it's like, who is that person who is most followed at Georgia State University? It's a young woman who does beauty tips for young African-American women in Georgia. Those are the people you want to be talking to other folks about getting involved in elections.
All right, thank you, Bob. And I'll turn last to Tom to see if he has any thoughts on the media or the quality of information.
Well, on the one hand, it's easy to be appalled at the current state of media affairs. On the other hand, I think it's equally easy to say that there is such a vast amount of useful information available. I would urge the promotion of skepticism and diligence on the part of citizens. Hey, wait a minute, what am I reading, or what are you saying to me? I'm going to tell a quick story that Edward Kennedy told me about his grandfather, Honey Fitz, running for office all the time in Massachusetts. One of his opponents hired a guy, he was named Knuckles McCormick. And Knuckles would start every day when the campaign got going, just getting on trolleys. And he'd engage someone in conversation. It would turn toward whatever the local campaign was. And Knuckles would say something like, it's just a terrible shame that Honey Fitz spends all this time in the saloons instead of with his wife and family. And then he would get off the trolley and get on another one and repeat his story. And word of mouth could be quite impactful in those days. And Honey Fitz's people heard about it, and they hired a guy who hung around the headquarters of his opponent until he saw Knuckles going out for his day of misinformation. And he would follow Knuckles. And when he got on a trolley, this guy would get on the trolley. And before Knuckles could speak, he'd start pointing him out as a worker for the other campaign. And his misinformation had no currency on that trolley car anyway. And if you expand that to the media universe, I think you can see how it's something that can be there are counters to it if we're diligent about it.
Okay, then. All right. Thank you so much for that, to Tom, and to all the panelists. So before I jump into the next question, I want to let everybody know out there in Zoom land that if you're trying to scribble stuff down from the chat while people are speaking, you can actually save the chat. There should be, depending on how you're looking at Zoom, there's an option. If you have on a desktop, if you're in the chat, go to the very top, there's 3 dots, click on it, you'll get a drop-down menu, and it'll say, one of the options will be save this chat. So that way you can listen to everyone and then look at the other stuff later. Just wanted to let you know that's an option you have. So the next question is, well, it's going to come up because the rhetoric's already, out there. Someone asks, Miriam asks, what does it mean to, quote, lose our democracy? We have this whole thing about, democracy is hanging in the balance. We're going to lose democracy. And alternatively, what does it mean to gain democracy? What would, if somebody said, what would make democracy better? What would that look like? Is that better leadership? Is that more people voting? What exactly would an ideal democracy look like versus what does it mean to lose the democracy? What concerns should we have, and what should we be looking for symptoms of that? For this, let's see, I have not let Bob start on one of these rounds, so I'll go ahead and turn first to Bob to see if you have any thoughts on that, and then I'll ask the other panelists. Bob, you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think there's a couple of different things to think about. First, what I talked about earlier, which is to the extent there's an explicit effort to reduce the access to voting and to intimidate voters and to intimidate people that run elections, that is a slippery slope, and one that unfortunately we've begun to see. The other is something that, obviously unprecedented in our history, when Trump lost the election and tried to really engineer staying in office in extra legal ways. So both are important and extremely scary, and we need to, figure out how to push back against that, which is why I think it's an awfully important reason to get people to be involved in voting. I can tell you, though, we can't just say, we need to save our democracy, go vote. We have to be more explicit about than that. And we have to, because ultimately our democracy is about, as Shannon was talking about, protecting the values that we want to live by, and we want our neighbors to be advantaged of. And if we lose our democracy, then all that goes out the window, obviously.
All right, thanks for that. And speaking of Shannon, I'll turn to Shannon and see if she has any thoughts to share on this question.
I'm not sure which way I fall, if I think we're losing or gaining a democracy. I mean, certainly from like my indigenous neighbors, they talk to me about I'm like, oh, I'm so disappointed in the election cycle. And they're like, we're not. Like, guess what? Guess what elections were like when y'all first started coming here. So, I mean, from the perspective of Guam or Puerto Rico, are we a democracy? Are we an empire? I mean, we still definitely have elements of that. That being said, I think a great way to regain control of our democracy, I think Citizens United has been the biggest threat. And the money in politics is the biggest threat, because if you have to be a billionaire or, independently wealthy, or, from a political family in order to run for office, that's a problem. That's not a democracy. Democracy is where, anyone has the right to vote, anyone has the right to run, anyone has the right to lead, and the best ideas win. When money buys election results, we're not going to have a full democracy because corporations have more say than individuals. But I've seen two models. Well, and I think we also need to change the first past the post system. But regarding money, publicly funded elections and the way that the public matching funds work at local levels has really evened the playing field. And there's propositions around, this concept called democracy vouchers. So if people are given democracy vouchers that they can then invest in a campaign, they don't have to put their own money in it, but this is worth, $100 or $200 or whatever, put it towards whatever political campaign you care about most, or several, give people a way to influence the direction of elections as much as, the political action committees. Because, and this is my, last thing. If you go onto Netflix and watch Knock Down the House, you'll see me there being very hopeful and then being very sad, because while I was working with Alex Ocasio and Cori Bush, I was also working with 70 other congressional candidates across the country. And, I was there for Alex's win in the Bronx on election day. And I was also there every time the rest of those 69 of the 70 lost their elections, had lost their jobs, some lost their cars, some lost their homes. Everyone was in debt. These people are working class folks. They're nurses, they're teachers, they're truck drivers. And they went out of their way to fight for our democracy, to show that it's still possible. And then all of those people and all of the people who were supporting those people felt that disappointment and the actual physical, financial impacts of what loss means to them. So let's work on that issue.
All right. Thank you, Shannon. By the way, if you haven't seen the chat, you just got your first vote for president. So,
Yeah.
Tom, any thoughts on this?
Yes, it's in the form of a question to Shannon. It seems to me that there's a campaign going on sort of behind the scenes right now between, on the one hand, how to be involved, and on the other, whether to be involved, whether there's any point to it. And I wanted to get your reaction to a really amazing development this week involving your old boss. AOC took $250,000 from her political fund and transferred it to the Democratic Party Congressional Campaign Committee. I'm sure if there's a Democratic House next year, AOC will be nipping at the heels of the leadership every day. But I was wondering if you could talk about what she did and whether there's a lesson in it for the rest of it.
Well, this might be ignorance on my own part, but isn't that kind of assumed to be one of the duties and obligations of Democratic House members? Like, you contribute to the Democratic Coordinating Committee, or at least
not like that. This is
unprecedented.
We deplore the money, of course, ultimately, but this is a big deal. There's a message that is contained in the contribution, including the size of it. And do you hear AOC saying something beyond just merely transferring a few dollars?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I knew her as a person and an organizer before I knew her as a politician. She wasn't a politician yet when I met her. And her values are very much collective liberation,
Right.
beloved community for everyone in our community, not just the people that we like or the people that we find tasteful. Like everyone deserves basic, decent, human dignity, human rights. And if we extend that to Congress, even if you dislike some of your peers, like their survival of their communities should matter to you. So people might be frustrated with, some of her decisions, some of the, I mean, there's a portion of the left that thinks that she's a traitor, and I keep being like, y'all are greatly mistaken. This is the system. This is the system. But if we want to keep something, we have to invest in it. We will be worse off. And, especially like my compatriots in states that now have these, extreme abortion laws, like their safety depends on me also. So yeah, that would be the message that I give to other young people or disillusioned folks is like, follow the example of somebody who knows how hard it is on the inside and is still taking care of her colleagues. We don't have to be pleased with the
I
system.
also think it's,
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, no, please.
I was going to say, I think it's also interesting and a tribute that a progressive woman can amass, real money in the political sense, and that as she should, because of who, what she represents. And that's just part of it. I agree with you. It's part of it is because there's too much that we all have at stake in this election. But I think, you have to celebrate that not being a traitor, she's showing that somebody with her values could have.
Yeah.
Okay. There we have it. Now,
Can I sneak in there for a second, Darren?
you can, yes, you can. Go right ahead, Susan.
I'm the one that put down the lose the democracy thing. First of all, read the book, by Heather Cox Richardson. She will explain it in detail, but I just want to say that go look for Project 2025, which is the manifesto put together by the people around Trump, and you will find out what a not democracy looks like, an autocracy or an oligarchy or something. It means losing some freedoms that we take for granted. And I don't care if you're 15 or you're 105, there are things in there that we absolutely take for granted. They will go away, and some of them. And I think about that a lot. And again, Heather elucidates all that. If you want to see, I know it's easy to just say the democracy goes away, but it starts with voting. And I know we look at parliamentary forms in Australia and England and other places, and it seems like it all goes smoothly. They have their issues as well. And most of the people who, historians and everybody else, say this is an experiment. Democracy is an experiment. But if we don't invest in it and we don't put our money and heart and soul, it's going to be evolving, and we must know that. And one of the things that they're trying to get rid of now is the Electoral College, which just, you'll excuse the term, sucks. We need to have a better way of doing these things, but we can't make those changes unless we invest in saving the democracy.
Okay, thank you, Susan. I'm going to do a 1-minute thing here and then let Susan Hoffman have the last word and take us out, because we're almost we're almost to closing time. So I want to give a very big and heartfelt shout out thanks to Tom and Bob and Shannon and Susan for all of your insights, some sobering insights, but also, lots of room for us to remain optimistic, whether on the political left or the political right. I think the two big enemies are apathy and indifference, and I think you've all four given us good reason to think we can prevail over them. So thanks for all of your insights, and I will now turn it over to Susan H. To take us to closing time. Susan?
Darren, thank you for moderating, and thank you, Shannon, Susan, Tom, and Bob. It's been a wonderful hour and a half. Obviously, there's a lot of tough work ahead of us for those of us who care. We want to say Susan Driscoll and I will be setting an organizing meeting so that people can meet both in person at the OLLI headquarters as well as on Zoom. And so we will go through all of the available kind of blueprints for action. Hopefully, I've asked Bob if maybe his toolkit is something that could be used by OLLI members as well. But we will seek to get a compilation of information and of organizations where you can get involved. So thank you for your involvement today, hanging in there, being a part of the back and forth, which is a part of democracy. So thanks again, everybody, for coming.